Hi, everyone. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to begin discussing Sigmund Freud, his book Civilization and Its Discontent. I'm going to walk through a little bit some of the background of regarding who Freud was and his position as a thinker. Perhaps you know him already as a psychologist above all, and he is perhaps known more in psychology than in philosophy. However, I do believe by at least the time of his late work, we can find some philosophical arguments going on, particularly in this book. So just a little bit of framing questions I think that will help us understand what it is that's really motivating Freud's theory of the mind and of the unconscious. Freud is interested, as many of the philosophers we've encountered before, with the idea of personhood or what it means to be a self. What is identity? Is there some underlying identity that I can understand and perhaps once I understand it, have some kind of agency, some kind of responsibility for my actions. So Freud will have very powerful and very difficult and controversial ideas about what it means to be a self. And then I think a more psychological question is the question of motivation and behavior. We will see that Freud's psychoanalytic perspective is deeply concerned with the way in which human beings seem to not actually be that in control of their own behavior at times, that our own motives seem to be a mystery to us. And Freud is deeply interested in that opacity that we have with respect to our own desires, our own drives, and our own repeated patterns of behavior. So I think Freud will have a lot to say to us about deciphering the code of our own motive. And then I think as we get more into the details of the book, we will see that he is interested in a question that all social and political theorists are interested in, and it's the question of the relationship between the individual, her motives, her interests, and the interests of society in general. Are there any conflicts that exist between the interests of the individual and the interests of the society? And of course, Freud will pretty early on argue, indeed, there are huge conflicts between the individual and society. Hence the title Civilization and Its Discontents. There will be something um, inextricably discontented about the human being within the walls of civil society or civilization. And then I think this is a book about happiness and gratification at the end of the day. Freud will be interested in what are the obstacles to my happiness. And I think you should read Freud as someone who is perhaps above all interested in first trying to identify the threats to our happiness within civilization, but then to find strategies for overcoming those obstacles and perhaps reach some kind of, if not happy, at least contented or reconciled position to the conflicts that we encounter in life. So those are big questions, obviously, and we'll have to look a little bit further into the details of how Freud goes about the business of answering some of them. Just a little bit of biography. We know a lot about Freud's life because he became very, very famous very early in his practice as a psychiatrist, as a psychoanalyst. Freud is kind of a transitional figure, turn of the century figure, born in 1856 and living to 1939. He is born in a very small town called Freiburg in Moravia, which was then part of Bohemia, to a very Jewish family. Um, Pretty soon, however, the family moves to Vienna, Austria, where Freud will spend the vast majority of his life. As a young person, he is a very gifted student. He reads voraciously, but he is drawn to the medical sciences and, in particular, neurology. So he begins medical training around this time. And from what I understand, he spent a lot of his early medical practice dissecting animals of various kinds, trying to understand the anatomy of neurological systems. And this seems to be the course that Freud was headed in for quite some time. He was going to be essentially a neurologist and a very skilled practitioner of surgery, which was then in its infancy essentially. So Freud was very excited by discoveries in medical science and discoveries in neuroscience, what we would call neuroscience today. However, according to biographers, he pretty early on hits a brick wall in terms of being unable to really answer some of the more abstract questions we have been dealing with. He starts to become convinced that the key to the riddle of who your identity is not going to be found in the anatomy of the brain. So he's kind of a critic of materialism in this sense, right? He will argue that if you're trying to find the person and the drives and the motives of personhood in the brain, you're looking in the wrong place. So very early on now, he kind of knows that perhaps neurology is not going to be the place for him to really pursue his interests. Um, as luck would have it, he discovers another somewhat remote science in its infancy in France, in Paris, sort of developing around this guy, a fellow named Jean-Martin Charcot. And Charcot, from what I understand, um, was a practitioner of what amounted to a kind of hypnotherapy for patients suffering from what they call neurosis. We would kind of call it trauma of various kinds. And believe it or not, Charcot would conduct his hypnotherapy on patients in open stadiums with other doctors observing. And Charcot at least believed that his practice was alleviating of certain symptoms of what we would basically broadly call mental illness or trauma. And Freud was totally fascinated by this procedure and started to become persuaded that the path to understanding psychic life, the path to understanding mental life, is a much more mysterious and but also analytical and non-material process of articulation and reflection. So he collaborates at this time in the 1880s with Charcot and will further refine Charcot's procedure as a therapist. So Freud's earliest work is really kind of a talk therapy practice. It's not philosophy. He is a medical doctor doing therapy. Um, let's see, Freud develops a little bit more and refines the methods of psychoanalysis further with a fellow named Joseph Breuer throughout the 1880s, and Breuer would have helped him um, narrow in on certain core concepts that he will deploy throughout the use of his practice as a psychoanalyst. And really, it's together throughout their case studies that they invent psychoanalysis as a discipline. Psychoanalysis is the special branch of psychology that Freud and Freudians alike um, are adherents of, and psychoanalysis, by and large, works by, um, as you can see, having a patient sit down on a couch and free associate or just speak off the cuff for a very long, extended periods of time. And the idea of this was that you would eventually allow your unconscious mental life to emerge, that whatever your motives were, perhaps some event of trauma in your past that you no longer could remember, those things would rise to the surface of mental life. And that was shown to be deeply curative, deeply helpful of symptoms of neurosis. So Freud's first book is called Case Studies of Hysteria, co-written with Breuer during this time. And very quickly, he would send a kind of tidal wave through Europe as the founder of psychoanalysis and the idea of an unconscious mind. All right, and we'll talk more about the unconscious. So the idea here, and I don't want to obscure Freud for you, uh, the concept of the unconscious holds that the mind is by and large not transparent to itself, that the mind is hidden. I like to think of it as if most of our mental life is sort of happening as a stream of consciousness, if I have the thought to myself, pick up the cup of coffee, it seems that there's nothing very mysterious about that mental action. But Freud argues that that's just the surface. Beneath that surface is a deep ocean of very hidden and unknown drives that are present right away in infancy and shape one's life throughout. It's really the majority of mental life is this hidden, unconscious, beneath the surface level kind of territory, which he's going to have to theorize a little bit more what's in there. So the mental life that we all are governed by is really driven by very unknown drives or instincts, desires for certain kinds of pleasure, desires for certain kind of gratification. And because they're unknown to us, there's a way in which, for Freud, we can often become almost slaves to those drives. We're not necessarily in control of um, our own selfhood. There's something a little bit beyond ourselves that is totally psychic, and it has a biological sort of foundation, but is not merely biological either. And then Freud will argue at various points contra philosophy, contra the history of philosophy, that the mind is largely irrational. The unconscious, at least, is deeply irrational, at least from the standpoint of modern philosophy, which portrays the individual as a rational actor. Right? Freud does not, by and large, think of human beings as rational actors. We are largely irrational, and the drives are very much kind of primitive impulses towards gratification of various kinds. Now, we do have to eventually learn how to become more rational because civilization just simply won't allow it, that we won't. So we will have to make that kind of step of assimilating a level of rationality and autonomy and agency to conscious mental life, but always lingering beneath the surface is this irrational self. Okay, so Freud is really radically disrupting the history of metaphysics and the history of epistemology as projects which portray the human as rational, individuated, identical, self-identical, and autonomous, kind of sovereign, right? If you go back to John Stuart Mill, or perhaps like a figure like Rene Descartes, all these epistemologies are premised on the notion that I am basically in touch with myself. I am the driver of who I am. Freud argues you're not the driver of who you are. You are driven by other things that you're not really in control of. Okay, and that's where he steps in. And that's where the practice of psychoanalysis steps in to shed some light on that mysterious, irrational self. All right. To get a little more specific, Freud, throughout his early life, spends a lot of time trying to categorize the different domains of mental life. And he works this out through a long sequence of both working as an analyst, but also as a speculative philosopher. And I don't want to give the impression that these are concepts that he begins with and then plugs into his study of people. I think the concepts were only ever the product of his work with people. Nevertheless, it does seem to fall into three schematic parts. Uh, we have this idea of a conscious self that is in conflict with an unconscious self, right? And this will be a fundamental contradiction or tension throughout Freud's life, throughout all of his writings. And the three parts of the self, Freud argues, are the id, which is totally unconscious and motivated by pleasure. It then comes into conflict with the ego, which is the conscious self, which is capable of rationality. And then there's a kind of mediating self called the superego, which is involved in regulation and discipline and self-consciousness. All right, so we'll return to those three concepts, and you'll see them sort of circulate throughout the book. All right, so right away, Freud will argue or make very bold claims about this idea of the pleasure principle, right? He says that the unconscious is governed by the pleasure principle. So I just want you to think about what does it mean to be governed? What does it mean to have a part of your mind governed by the pleasure principle? What is the principle that shapes mental life? For Freud, the pleasure principle demands that human beings find pleasure and comfort and gratification. It's really impossible to exist, according to Freud, without some bare level pursuit of pleasure. It's just human nature. If you think about an infant is kind of all me, just interested in instant gratification, instant comfort. And if the infant doesn't get what he or she wants, she cries, right? So that's a human being clearly in the grip of the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle has in part a biological basis, right? Because human beings need some bare material things like nutrition and shelter, right? So the pleasure principle is in part mediated by preservation and by the need to survive, but it'll have certain elements of it that transcend mere survival as well, and that become a little bit more complex. Okay, but it's sort of our hard wiring that we pursue pleasure and happiness. All right. Freud very interestingly defines pleasure in totally negative terms. In other words, it's not so much that pleasure is a good that we are trying to possess. Pleasure really for him is negative. It's the reduction of anxiety and excitation. So anytime in life that we're able to reduce that kind of feeling of the world being noisy and scary and threatening, anytime we're able to reduce that low level feeling, we experience it as pleasure. Um, so I encourage you to think about first: is Freud right about that? Is pleasure purely negative? Is it purely the lowering of anxiety and excitation? Um, and then, secondly, and maybe more importantly, what kind of implications will there be for the theory if he is so strongly kind of determining pleasure as this negative capacity? All right, I'll return to this issue as a pleasure as a problem in the book, but just note that pleasure is this reduction of excitation. Pain is the opposite. Pain is the increase of the amount of pain, anxiety, or excitation I might experience in reality. And Freud's theory holds that from infancy through childhood, through adulthood, through our elderly years, reality is just basically painful. He is a deeply pessimistic philosopher of life in a way because he just seems to suggest that there's something intrinsically painful about being in the world. There's something about the mere fact of having to survive and adapt and respond to people and worry about their judgment that is going to be nervously exciting. And so we all have to sort of find ways to cope with this pain and this pleasure. We have to find ways to manage both. There's never going to be a life free from pain, and there's certainly not going to be a functioning person who doesn't have any pleasure in life. So how can we cope? How can we find some balance between pain and pleasure? That's a deep concern of Freud in a way that perhaps is not true, except for Epicurus. Notice that there is a good deal of overlap between Freud and Epicurus and the whole school of spiritual therapy, inasmuch as Epicurus too defined the good as pleasure and the bad as pain, and typically the Epicureans understood happiness as the kind of restriction of potential pains to my sphere of experience. Right, it wasn't so much that you should gorge on as many fine foods and drinks as possible. It's the Epicurean kind of prescription was to have a restricted sphere of pleasure that would be imperturbable and impervious to the pain of reality. I think Freud is a fellow Epicurean, at least on this issue. All right. Okay, so Freud writes here on the issue of the pleasure principle. If you have a look, It's actually a bolder claim than just the definition of the pleasure principle, but we do get the definition as well. He writes, what decides the purpose of life is simply the program, the pleasure principle. So you might think that's actually strange language to think of the purpose of our life being decided by a program. It's like we're hardwired or maybe soft wired to pursue pleasure. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy, and yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as the microcosm. Okay, so we have this like programming which insists that I pursue pleasure. It just simply insists that I try to reduce the pain of reality, right? I can't survive as a living organism without some attempts to reduce excitation. All right. And yet he's saying this program, my desire for pleasure and my desire for the absence of pain, is at loggerheads with the world. So ask yourself why? Why is it, or in what manner is it the case that my gratification and my needs are at loggerheads with the world? Is that true, do you think? Freud is setting up a pretty big conflict that's going to, he believes, be universal for all human beings in their development from infancy to adulthood. On another note, there I should just point out that unlike most of the thinkers we've read, maybe all of them, um, Freud takes very seriously the point of view of the infant and the child as totally crucial to understanding human mental life. Philosophers are in this kind of bad habit of beginning the analysis with the full-grown rational adult. Maybe some references to women and children here or there and Rousseau, right? But by and large, the ground of investigation is the adult. Freud says that's totally wrong. We have to go way back. We have to go back to infancy and think about what forces shaped mental life early on. How does our relations with our parents shape us, for example, right? How does our upbringing and the milieu in which we're raised shape us? So Freud is really a developmental thinker. He's interested in the idea of the self and of mental life being a process that is in motion and can come into serious problems if it doesn't develop in a healthy way. All right, so we've got the pleasure principle, and Freud will argue right away in chapter one of Civilization and his Discontents that the pleasure principle comes into conflict with the reality principle. He defines the reality principle as the law that the self cannot pursue pleasure without consequences. Really, this is just a way of saying that if I do have a pleasure principle, I have this program which demands I reduce pain. The real world exists out there in such a way to teach me that I might totally be incapable of pursuing the pleasure principle, right? I cannot just pursue whatever my immediate desires are without consequence, right? And as soon as the infant grows up and starts to learn rules from her parents and perhaps goes to school and learns a little bit more discipline, you come to understand that the real world out there is governed by a kind of principle that's a little bit antithetical or hostile to the pleasure principle. Okay, so think of these principles as in tension with each other. The reality principle, sorry, this should be RP, imposes rules, laws, taboos, and inhibitions on the pleasure principle. So we've got these two principles at war with each other, kind of in mental life, and Freud is going to try to find or first analyze what the consequences are for when they don't reach a kind of equilibrium or a balance. So also just think about what are the sources of this reality principle according to Freud? Where does that feeling come from that, as I enter the real world, you come to understand, oh, I have to conform a little bit to what other people demand of me. What are those instances early in life that really give you the impression that actually the world is pretty indifferent to your pleasure, right? That's the first kind of hard lesson of reality. The reality principle insists on the indifference of the objective world to your pleasure, All right, and that's going to be an even more sort of pronounced problem as the whole story of civilization unfolds in the book. Freud writes the program of becoming happy, which the pleasure principle imposes on us, cannot be fulfilled. So, a little clue there: we're never going to fully gratify the pleasure principle. All right. Yet we must not, indeed, we cannot give up our efforts to bring it nearer to fulfillment by some means or other. So there's a conflict here, right? On the one hand, we have to do something that we know will fail. We have to pursue pleasure. We are it is in our nature. It's in our blood. It's in our mental structure to pursue pleasure and gratification. Yet we know on some level we will never fully reach a state of absolute contentment and pleasure. And yet we can't give up the pursuit. We are stuck with pursuing what our nature determines us to pursue. So this is in a way the tragedy that Freud is, sort of putting out there for humanity. We have to, we're bound to pursue something that we know we will fail in, right? So he's loading the dice a little bit in terms of how this story is going to play out at a social and civilizational level, because if it means we are bound to fail in our pursuit of happiness in life on some bare level, it means discontent is going to be pretty inevitable to the story, right? Okay, so that's kind of backdrop stuff. That's the basic, skeleton of Freud's metapsychology and Freud's kind of theory of the unconscious. And now I want to move a little bit forward with the book Civilization and its Discontents. This book actually comes relatively late in Freud's work, published in 1930, and I think it's good to read it first in a way because involves a lot of Freud looking back on his whole body of work and coming to some very general conclusions about what he believes he has innovated in science. And I think the big driving question of the piece is, how can humans be happy? How can we become happy within civilization? So this will be a story about happiness. Right away in chapter 2, he will talk about very kind of um, common obstacles or sources of pain and unpleasure that many human beings experience. He will talk about the fact that the body grows old and often gets sick or injured. Right, that's a very concrete way in which happiness can be thwarted. He will talk about the conflicts that emerge through human relations and relations of love, above all, which can become extremely painful. Right, so that will be another primary conflict throughout the piece. And then he will talk about kind of short sighted or limited strategies that people tend to pursue the pleasure principle, things like drugs or money or just like creature comforts, right? Which might actually, succeed in the short time in reducing excitation, but ultimately produce further pains in the long run, right? So there's going to be this interesting kind of back and forth throughout the first half of the book. And then Freud will name civilization in terms of a paradox that he believes to be operative at every level in terms of the institutions that really prevail in civilization. And the paradox is this: he argues human beings made civilization in order to gratify themselves, right? On some level, civilization as a whole, its genesis is in the pleasure principle, because what civilization does is it provides protection, and it provides a space where we can flourish and where we can make art, we can develop our science and our medicine. So on the one hand, it has this very positive, pleasure seeking, gratifying dimension, and yet at the same time, civilization seems to be the very source of our unhappiness, in as much as it is the representative of the reality principle, right? It is the walls of civilization which tell us that, in fact, we cannot, in an uninhibited way, pursue our pleasure, right? I have to regulate my behavior. I have to inhibit my drives. I have to accommodate myself to custom. I have to perhaps surrender some of my immediate pleasure seeking behavior to a kind of group or perhaps a group authority. So civilization is this contradictory phenomenon of at once being the result of the pleasure principle, but being imposing itself as a kind of collective reality principle as its result. So we're stuck in this kind of back and forth of making something that, on the one hand, improves us and yet now functions as a barrier to our gratification. And that's the central paradox that Freud will be trying to work out at every level of the book. In the first chapter, you will notice he will analyze the institution of religion, which is, of course, a foundational, if not fundamental, institution of civilization. And he will try to do a psychoanalytic derivation of where religious life comes from. What is the psychic, I guess, birth of religion? And they will consider the possibility that it is a kind of um, desire for the oceanic, or a kind of oceanic feeling that is a desire to be reunited with the cosmos, right? Freud will ultimately disagree with that analysis, but he nevertheless takes seriously the idea that all of religious life has this component of trying to um, cure a fundamental wound in the human being, the wound being the separation of the self from the outside world. And there will be then, as we move through the book, a return very much to the social contract theory that we got in people like Hobbes and Rousseau, where Freud will sort of give a psychoanalytic reading of that very contract. He will argue that the social contract, i.e., the founding of civilization, is not, or was not, a rational transfer of natural liberty for security, but was rather a deeply unconscious and unwitting product of the drives embedded in the need to survive. Right. And it's going to be a contract of sorts after the fact only. All right. So we'll have to have a look at some of those details here. But just for now, Freud writes, this contention holds that what we call our civilization is largely responsible for our misery. So civilization is largely why we are unhappy, and that we should be much happier if we gave it up and returned to primitive conditions. I call this contention astonishing because, in whatever way we may define the concept of civilization, it is a certain fact that all the things with which we seek to protect ourselves against the threats that emanate from the sources of suffering are part of that civilization. So that's a restatement of the paradox of civilization. The idea being, um, we have tried to protect ourselves from the threats of external nature, from a natural wilderness that in prehistoric or pre-civilized times would have meant we couldn't have satisfied the pleasure principle at all, right? Because we would barely live throughout the day. A la Hobbes' state of nature, right? It would have been a condition of misery. Uh, but here now, Freud is like twisting the story in Hobbes a bit to say that, yes, indeed, we were able to gratify one need, the need for survival, but that comes at a price. And the price is that I now have to act in a very inhibited, or what he will call aim inhibited way, right? And so, we're going to have to come up with clever ways of gratifying the unconscious, right? And that will be a big part of what he means by sublimation. All right, that will be the key idea for the first three chapters. So as you continue to read the main chapters of the book, I just urge you to sort of keep these problems in mind, or back of your mind, or try to read with an eye towards these problems. One, how can the individual become happy in a civilization that regulates the pleasure principle? In other words, what is Freud trying to tell us about how it is we can become happy when he has sort of already said that we can't, right? That's sort of his dilemma. Um, I think at the end of the day, you will probably find Freud to be a pretty pessimistic thinker. In as much as he doesn't really believe it's sort of in the program of the human being to find that ultimate contentment, or ataraxia, as um, Epicurus would define it. But there are levels of adjustment that are better and worse, right? So what are those better ones? All right. And then when we get into particularly chapter 3 and 4, which has to do with the birth of community in a kind of state of nature, um, try to think about how Freud is sort of rewriting that script. How is he going back to the story of the social contract to give it a psychological explanation, right? How what information is he filling in that perhaps Hobbes and Rousseau was not able to fill in? All right, based on the idea of the unconscious in particular. All right, and finally, can the discontents of whole civilizations be overcome? The second half of the book will turn from the analysis of the individual and the individual's conflict with society to conflicts of civilization in general. In other words, whole civilizations will become a problem for Freud in as much as they seem to have to regulate their own inner mental life, as it were. But towards the end of the book, as you'll see, Freud will seem to argue that the threats of aggression and regression are always sort of threatening to break through the surface of law and custom and taboo. Okay, so uh, try to think about whether or not Freud believes that at the end of the day, civilization can work. Basically, can it deliver the promise of gratification for the individuals who compose it? Um, so we're gonna stop there, but we will return to the book and have a look at chapter one, which is Freud's analysis of religion. Try to look at the back and forth that Freud gets into with Romain Rolland over the sources of religious experience, and think about why Freud is in particular so keen on getting to the root of what motivates religious life in civilization. And then chapter two will be a return to the meta psychology, the issues of the pleasure principle and the reality principle, as I've outlined in here. Okay, so we will continue the discussion next time.